Hello and welcome. Who could have guessed that anti-Semitism might be the one phenomenon that would drive human beings towards a disastrous nuclear war? Anti-Semitism didn't start at Auschwitz, but it reached what any civilized non-Nazi could hope was its nadir, the lowest moment in what we call civilization until recently. As for me as a teenager, it was discovering what had happened at Auschwitz that not only shocked me to the core, but started the whole process of my thinking about theodicy. How can there be a God who calls himself good but allows so much pure evil, evil beyond an unperverted imagination to grasp it? And as with so many people, it was the display of the gassed children's shoes and glasses that brought home the depth of the evil. In fact, whilst I was trying to work out whether or not I was agnostic about God, I discovered that no stretch of the imagination could allow me to believe that human beings were incapable of this depth of evil. They had either to have been infected or duped or taken over by evil for there to be an explanation. I readily accepted the objective reality of evil in the face of anti-Semitism and the way it was expressed at Auschwitz. I could see what previous generations beyond Orthodox Christianity had hypothesized as an evil demiurge, a maker of this world. And it's not a very large step from there to what Jesus taught in St. John's Gospel, that there was in fact a perverse spirit who was the de facto ruler of this world, though not its creator. Instead, a malign agency who had control or influence of humanity's heart. But for a moment, let us indulge or try out our own Christian hypothesis. What if the Jews are God's chosen people, adopted to cooperate with him, to show the other nations what an experiment in holiness looks like? Beyond the fact or assertion of this, what other implications might this have? What knock-on effect? Well, we might expect two phenomena in particular: a great giftedness, and as it happens, this tiny population has produced 22% of all Nobel Prize winners, the gold standard of genius. To say nothing of musicianship and artistry, for example, the number of Jews who are leading composers, conductors, and prodigy instrumentalists is phenomenal. But we might expect too, if our map of metaphysics is right, that they would attract great evil, a kind of malign spiritual jealousy. Anti-Semitism under that worldview would provide a scale of the pollution of evil in the collective and personal human heart that we could measure. Again, it's true, no other nation has suffered the kind of visceral hatred the Jews have endured, universal pogroms through time and place. Terrifyingly, though, we may be entering a new dimension of the scaling up of this particular kind of hatred, and that has theological and spiritual implications of a profound kind. It's been pointed out recently by some commentators that the Nazis knew they were doing something profoundly wrong, even according to their own standards, and tried to hide it. It took years to get the full evidence of the Holocaust to prosecute them for it. What has been most shocking about the attacks by the Arabs of Gaza on the Jews in Israel, where they burnt babies alive and beheaded them, was that so far from trying to cover up what they did, unlike the Nazis, they publicized it. They live-streamed the executions of grandmothers and the execution of babies. It's been very strange for those of us born not long after the Second World War and who were profoundly touched by the horror of the inhumanity of Nazi anti-Semitism, its scale, its irrationality and its power, to see it return again with renewed, deeper hatred, not with European culture as the host carriers, but as part of the repertoire of Muslim hatred. Why should Islam and Muslims be infected with this intense hatred of the Jews? We need to ask ourselves that question. For the events in Israel and Gaza have presented the world with a profound shock. How do we manage this depth and extent of hatred theologically, sociologically, psychologically, spiritually even? We must choose which language we're going to use to try and deal with this. We can talk politically, describing two groups of people contesting the same land, each appealing to different historical, political narratives of legitimacy. We can talk psychologically and morally as we have access to an analysis of what Muhammad experienced as a certain envy or jealousy of the Jews' prophetic charism. Angry it was unique to the Jews to be given all these prophets, wanting something of it for the Arabs and saying, at last it's here with me, Muhammad. But this jealousy also carries other implications, and they take us into the spiritual dimension. The Arabic and Islamic hatred has Israel and the Jews. The Arabic and Islamic hatred that the Arabs have for Israel and the Jews may turn out to be the attempt of taking revenge on God's people, out of rage against what he gave the world through their prophets and, as importantly, through the incarnation of the Word, the Logos, Jesus. It may be that evil has been looking for a host, and as with the rest of us, the moment we give in to serious sin, we make ourselves vulnerable to become used by the other side. The jealousy and rage of Arabic Islam may have become the gateway to the revenge of the evil one on the projects of God intended for our salvation. The quality of the hatred has had consequences we have had difficulty even imagining. The Muslim propagandists in Gaza have become willing to use even their own civilians, their own wives and their own children as human shields, with the intention of provoking Israelis to such rage and also provoking them into collateral killing of Gazan women and children. And this latest incursion into Israel seems to have been intended to create a response of revenge. Once again, in the scale of spiritual values, as we try to discern what's taking place, revenge is one of the most powerful and dangerous tools of darkness. And the attack was implemented with a strategy doing the maximum inhuman harm to Israeli unarmed and vulnerable civilians, particularly to women, children and babies, with the intention of provoking the Israeli army into revenge attacks on the civilians of Gaza, and thus perhaps to a toppling of the dominoes that might bring about political Armageddon, perhaps even nuclear. When Israel warns the civilians in Gaza to abandon the city in order to pursue the terrorist leaders of Hamas, Hamas strenuously urges them to stay as human shields. This whole strategy will depend upon the Israelis killing Palestinian civilians in revenge as they level Gaza to get to Hamas. The intention is to enrage the whole Islamic world and to galvanize a pan-Islamic response that will wipe out Israel. And while the politics have a stark simplicity to them, neither the ethics nor the religious background shares the same simplicity. In order to understand what's taking place, we have to talk about the place that revenge and forgiveness take play in the different major religions. The ethics of Islam and Judaism, particularly relating to forgiveness and revenge, differ considerably from Christianity. The religions also understand the nature of God very differently. Yahweh is knowable in Islam and particularly Christianity, but Allah is unknowable. The religions appear not only complex but inaccessible to the different and the other sides in this war of attrition, information and religion. They have different gods. They don't understand each other. In fact, a complete absence of any awareness of the difference in moral theology between Islam, Judaism and Christianity lies at the heart of the astonishing ignorance of political commentators and public opinion. Listening, for example, to some secular pundits from the like of Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, for example, both of whom are well educated, they set out to describe in succinct, compressed narratives the historic claims of Israel with a complete absence of the claim of the Jews to have been given the land of Israel by divine covenant. They recognise only they were temporary occupiers 2,500 years ago and came back, they say, illegitimately. To the left in politics, Jews are simply and only a recent illegitimate colonial force guilty for dispossessing the Arabs of Palestine. And hatred and revenge, spiritual toxicities, lie at the heart of the political impasse in the refusal of Arab Palestinians to accept any political compromise that would even allow for the existence of Israel. They are determined wholly on its complete extermination. Little mention of this is made in political punditry, but the failure to acknowledge this and its theological rationale makes both conversation and ethical analysis impossible. And to do this, some minimum grasp of the theological history of Islam becomes essential. We need to go back to Muhammad and to the Quran, and to ask questions about the authenticity which goes to the heart of the conflict that Islam finds itself with Judaism and Christianity. Was it really the angel Gabriel that inspired Muhammad? Embedded in both the Quran and the Hadith is the record of Muhammad with his experience of Jews and Judaism. Like much of the present conflict, it was both political and theological at the same time. And only by grasping its essentials can the non-negotiable anti-Semitism of Islam be understood. Few non-Muslims know very much of the history of early Islam and the two distinct stages of Muhammad's career as a hybrid prophet and warlord. But his encounters with the Jews at the very beginning were central and critical to the way in which his life and Islam developed. At the simplest level, as Muhammad fought for his life and his successes, he entered into a series of complex alliances. In the earlier part in Mecca, relying on the Jews in particular, he collaborated and forged allegiances. The earlier part of the Quran reflects this benign approach to both the Jews and the Christians he encountered. It's there we find, for example, the verses of religious collaboration. But after being driven out of Mecca into Medina, where he established his role as a successful warlord, his attitude changed, and so did the tone of the Quran. The Jews caused him offence in two ways. Firstly, they posed a theological problem to the authenticity of the revelation of the Quran. Muhammad combined a paradoxical admiration for the prophetic charisms of the Jews with a certain degree of jealousy. Why had the Jews been favoured with the outpouring of prophetic voices for 1,000 years? Why had God ignored the Arabs? He presented himself as the final prophetic voice in the Jewish tradition of prophecy, which included, of course, Isa, the name for Jesus in the Quran, but Muhammad was more authoritative than Jesus. Muhammad became increasingly hostile to the Jews as his claims and ambitions developed. He grew to perceive there were irreconcilable differences between their religion and his, especially when the belief in the authenticity of his prophetic mission became the criterion of a true Muslim. For the Jewish community challenged the way in which the Quran appropriated biblical accounts and personages. For example, it made Abraham an Arab and the founder of the Kaaba at Mecca. But the Jews denied Muhammad's claims. Muhammad responded by accusing them of intentionally concealing the true meaning of the Quran or entirely misunderstanding it. Needless to say, the theological clashes over his claims to represent biblical figures in the Quran weren't restricted to Abraham. They included Moses, David, Elijah, Ezekiel, Solomon, Jesus, and Mary. And when they read them, both Jews and Christians disowned these characters that Muhammad had imported into the Quran from the Old and the New Testaments. The names were indeed the same, but their characters, their roles, the words attributed to them, they were very different. They weren't the same people. Their use appeared to be a mixture of plagiarism and revisionism, and both Jews and Christians objected and rejected the claims of the Quran to be authentic revelation and the claims of Muhammad to be authentic prophet. And this act of theological repudiation was deeply offensive to Muhammad and Islam. And in the case of Judaism, it was compounded by an early conflict called the Battle of the Trench. In 627, the Jews of Banu Qurayza were accused of conspiring with the Meccan enemies of Muhammad when he was at Medina, and Islamic forces attacked, defeated and captured this Jewish tribe. And in a notorious episode, Muhammad ordered that between 400 and 800 men, once captured, were to be beheaded. The antipathetic relationship between Jews and Muslims, always complex, began badly, and since Islam means submission and the Jews have been disinclined to surrender to the revisionist history of their identity to Muhammad, it continued to get worse. In the Hadith, the antagonism is codified with verses such as, "To Muslims, you will fight against the Jews and you will gain victory over them, and the stones will slay, O slave of Allah, there's a Jew hiding behind me, so kill him." The Quran also contains the verse, "Surely Allah has cursed the unbelievers and has prepared for them a burning fire." Any selection of Quranic verses ought to be accompanied by a commentary which recognizes there are benign verses to be found there too. But the difficulty is that the violent ones are predominantly nearer the end, and the principle of Quranic interpretation, called abrogation, gives precedence to later verses over earlier ones, violent ones over irenic ones. The conflict in Palestine and the competing claims to the land that set Muslim against Jew arise from each side having a wholly different set of histories and theologies. But let's leave aside the Gordian knot of their competing complexity. The Islamic view has since then hardened into hatred. A theological exploration of the spirituality of hatred and forgiveness as a two-faced practice is sharply needed, beyond just the simplicities of the early origins we've just described. In a conflict where babies are beheaded, civilians are deemed to be soldiers, and a whole series of spiritual, ethical, and metaphysical considerations require examination. The depth and intractability of the conflict is well reflected by the comments of the Salafi Egyptian Islamic scholar and author, the contemporary Sheikh Mohammed Hussein Yaqub, a well-known voice in Egyptian Islam. "If the Jews left Palestine to us," he said, "would we start loving them? Of course not. They would have been our enemies even if they did not occupy anything. Our fighting with the Jews is eternal, and it will not end until not a single Jew remains on the face of the earth. And as for you, Jews, the curse of Allah be upon you, you pigs of the earth." Al-Rahmah TV, 17th of January 2009. Set aside for the moment the sterile arguments about who did what to whom and when this conflict on the ground provokes. We ought to ask ourselves instead, where does the hate come from, both politically, which we know, but metaphysically? How do we call it out for hate? And given that forgiveness is the only antidote to hate, why is it that no Christian voices have been raised to offer Jesus as the only solution to this endemic jealousy, anger, revenge, tribalism, and hatred? This is no longer a matter of different belief content. This is becoming a matter of saving the human race from a nuclear Armageddon, where neighbour is in danger of needlessly destroying their neighbour in an act of either nuclear or even non-nuclear mutual destruction and eradication. A different focus and analysis from the conventional political and historical one is called for. Can forgiveness and the healing of the human heart become part of what is placed on the table as an antidote to the cultivation of hatred and revenge? This moment above all moments is the one for the Christian analysis to be offered. Christian spiritual discernment needs to be applied, and the presence and power of Christ with his invitation to forgiveness should be invoked as the only hope that humans have to escape destroying themselves and each other, both politically and metaphysically. As it happens, there is a whole range of Muslims who've converted to Christianity because they've encountered Jesus either through the pages of the Gospel or in dreams at night or in their Christian neighbours. And in encountering Jesus, they have found an experience of God the Father that only Jesus and the Holy Spirit give them. They've encountered in Jesus the capacity to forgive their enemies, to turn the other cheek, to begin again. The Church needs to recover its confidence in Jesus and to present Jesus as the antidote to this war of attrition between different images of God, different scales of ethics and metaphysics, and raise up a voice that promises the capacity to change and soften the human heart. For at the moment, the God of Islam seems expert in hardening the human heart. But the God of the Holy Trinity brings about this special miracle of softening, saving, and renewing the human heart. This is one of those moments in the politics and history where the character of Jesus, the character of Christian revelation, the character of the Christian God not only matter enormously, but may save us from ourselves politically and historically, as well as spiritually.